Hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is picking up where we left off last class, talking about phenomena. Now remember, phenomena are an integral component of causation. If we don't know that there's a stimulus, if we don't know that there's an effect, how can we know that one is causing the other? And causation, in turn, is very relevant, if not the most fundamental aspect of determining most risks. So when we want to know about risk, we want to know about causation. And when we want to know about causation, we must establish that a phenomenon exists, a cause and an effect. Without that, we can't know much at all. So today we're going to talk about the distinction between phenomena and illusions, things that seem to be true, but in fact don't exist. Because after all, if we're trying to establish this, we need to distinguish and suppress illusions. Let's go back to our definition of causation from the last class, a definition you're going to see time and again. Causation is a change in a stimulus that determines a directional change in an effect. Now, breaking this down here just so you can see where we are in the flow chart, we're talking about stimulus and effect right now, phenomena, things that occur, otherwise known as relata. We're not talking about determination, we're not talking about directionality. Those are topics for a future day. Right now, we're just trying to determine how does mankind objectively determine that a stimulus exists or an effect exists. Is it enough to say, it seems to me I have two hands and therefore I have two hands? Or do we need something more? Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. We're after that persistence, that thing that is staying and real and somehow actually there. At least that's what the courts say to us if you personally disagree. The Supreme Court said in Daubert versus Merrill Dow back in 1993 that in order to qualify as scientific knowledge, an inference or assertion must be derived by the scientific method. There has to be, in other words, a standard for scientific knowledge that establishes a standard of evidentiary reliability. There needs to be something reliable. We can't simply come in here and say, I'm a stronger personality than you and my perception trumps yours. This is not about a subjective might makes right world, or at least according to the Supreme Court, it's not. Another case in GE versus Joyner, the Supreme Court said that nothing requires a district court to admit opinion evidence, might makes right, which is connected to existing data only by the ipse dixit of the expert. A court may conclude there is simply too great an analytical gap between the data and the opinion proffered. In another statement within that same decision, Justice Breyer said that a trial judge acting as a gatekeeper must make subtle and sophisticated determinations about scientific methodology and its relation to the conclusions an expert witness seeks to offer. That testimony needs to be reliable. And why does Justice Breyer say this is necessary? So that the truth may be ascertained. This is also in Federal Rules of Evidence 101, the major reason why we have evidence in courts in the first place, to ascertain truth. Well, in that exactly is saying to us that there is a truth, an objective reality, something correct that we must find. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of might makes right. It's not a matter of force of character or persuasion or salesmanship. It's simply a matter of truth, and we need to get at it. So how do we find truth? Well, part of that is finding a reliable method for truth, and part of that is understanding what that method is measuring, and whether that method is measuring illusions or real phenomena. So let me ask you this, for example, just to take a silly case. Which is a more reliable tool for knowing what is 20 feet under the earth? A divining rod, one of those dipping rods that you use to find water or other things like that? Or a ground-penetrating radar? Now some of you will instantly jump, as some of my students have, to the ground-penetrating radar. It's a really cool picture you have here of graves underground that have been identified using ground-penetrating radar. And technology sort of has a hypnotic effect on most of us anyway, where if it's technical, we simply accept it must be true and it must measure correctly, although we can come back to question that later. But the divining rod, a simple stick of wood with a Y branch in it, some people swear by it and say that they can find gold, human bodies, or water, or any other sort of thing like oil, simply by walking around with a divining rod such as this woman has in the picture, dipping it to look for these hidden sources of treasure. Now some of you would say, well, that's silly. There's no proof that that works, and yet some people would swear by it. How do we know which is the reliable method? Or to take another case, Which is a more reliable tool for finding store merchandise that's missing? A Ouija board that we consult, or an RFID tag? Now, many people, when I ask polls about this, jump right to the RFID tag. Again, I wonder if this is just a fetish for technology, but people seem to prefer that over the Ouija board. Why? Do we not like mysticism? Do we not like tarot card readers or other people who do seances? Or is it that we just don't believe that this works? And if we don't believe that it's reliable, why don't we believe that? These are questions for the chat boards that I'd love to see you answer as we talk about this topic. Here's another example. Which one is a reliable method for viewing the word IBM spelled out in xenon atoms? Here's a nice photo of that. These are atoms made of xenon, an inert gas. Should we use a magnifying glass to view this photo? Or is this photo only realizable through an electron microscope? Picking the right tool in order to be able to view a phenomenon is just as essential as anything else. After all, if I'm trying to see what a rose smells like, using my fingers to feel it is not going to do much in that regard. Although you'll see later that the senses are integrated and holistic, and sometimes taking away one sense denies us entirely the understanding of what really is going on with our other senses. So it's somewhat of a mystery how the senses integrate, and integrating them oftentimes is essential to finding truth. So here's an example. Vincent van Gogh, famous artist from the 1800s doing impressionist work. Van Gogh used to do very persuasive and very bold brushstrokes, such as this one, which is Starry Night, one of his most famous paintings. Now, when we look at this painting, I think most of us can recognize why he called it Starry Night. We see in the upper right-hand corner what seems to be a crescent moon, along with swirls of stars in a darkened sky, with a bush in front and a small town with a church steeple in the rear. And yet, let me ask you, how many of you, when you actually go outside at night, see something that looks exactly like this? We can recognize this at some abstract level, but this is not what we see, or at least what most of us see, when we go outside on a starry night. And yet, here's the interesting thing. In the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 1988, it was conjectured that Vincent van Gogh was licking his paintbrushes, and his paintbrushes were dissolved in a solvent called thujone to take the paint off his brushes, and that thujone, when ingested, causes hallucinations. The conjecture was that the starbursts and the swirls that were there were not what Van Gogh was imagining, but in fact what he was seeing. He was painting reality as it appeared to him. Now the question then becomes, whose reality is real? Ours without the use of thujone, or Vincent van Gogh's where his brain was altered in its thinking and perception by the ingestion of thujone? We have to wonder, going back to the example we had in the last class of the African bushman and the astronaut, is the Earth flat or is it round? Is the sky full of starbursts or is it not? How do you know that a camera, for example, is a tool which makes distant things that you've never seen seem to exist is a reliable tool? For example, here's an alleged picture of Mars. It's red. We've all been told that Mars is red, and when you look through a telescope, it looks red. It looks rocky, and they tell us that it's rocky. But how do you know that this camera is in fact a reliable tool? Well, we all have some experience with cameras, and we seem to think that it captures reality in a realistic way when we look through the viewfinder. So, given that we use it under many circumstances and in many contexts, it is a faithful reproduction of reality. But it's not complete, and even using cameras, illusions can crop up. We need to be careful about how we in fact ascertain whether it's portraying it reliably or in fact misleadingly. Let's take another example. Fingerprints, used often in criminal law to identify suspects in various crimes. And yet Lewis Pollock, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in 2002, threw fingerprint evidence out of a criminal trial in his court, concluding that there was no substantial scientific evidence that showed that fingerprints in fact reliably identify suspects. This wasn't 100 years ago when fingerprint evidence was first being introduced. This was 2002, a mere decade ago. So how do we know, in fact, that fingerprints reliably identify suspects? We know we all have fingerprints. We've seen people leave them behind. but the specificity with which a given fingerprint identifies a given suspect is something that Pollack concluded was not knowledge. Another question that comes up recently is, again, going back to the issue of technology, whether technology can expand our understandings of behaviors or other things that go on that seem a mystery to us by looking and peering in things that we could never peer in before, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, which takes in effect a blood flow image of the brain. Here, in the upper diagram, you see healthy control subjects, with the blood flow lit up in red in the various areas of the brain. And then in the bottom portrayal of pictures, you see schizophrenic patients. Notice that their blood flow is atrophied and is not as great in various regions of the brain as it is in the healthy controls. Does that mean that we simply have inactive tissue and that schizophrenic patients simply are having some sort of blood flow control problem? Or some other sort of issue in which blood flow is atrophied and therefore we can see the damaged tissue regions of the brain? Do we trust this? Do we think that this gives us greater insight into what in fact is going on in the mind? Or has it misled us? When we get to the issue of phenomena, we have to dispel illusions. And what I'm going to start today, but then continue on in the next class with other forms of illusion, is talking about visual illusions, our sight. We all rely on it for the most part, and we trust it many times. But even our sight, something that has served us well in life to get us to the age we have, is something that can mislead us. In fact, Matthew Lukish in 1922, a magician, tells us there are numerous illusions which must be taken into account. All of our interest, many can be utilized, but some must be suppressed. And the question is, how do we know what is or is not an illusion? Well, some people play with our sight understandings. Here's Magritte, a famous French painter in 1926, with a painting here. In the French, it says below on the painting, "This is not a pipe." Now stop for a moment. Why is this not a pipe? Do you have an answer? Some of my students will say, well, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a wood hook, or it's a battering rod, or something else of that nature. But the actual answer that I think Magritte was trying to put forward is, it's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. Reality sometimes is described in better words than what we see. People who really understand reality often and be able to play with it are not just scientists who are trying to dispel illusions, but magicians who in fact play with illusions and introduce them where we normally trust our senses to tell us the truth, and we are shocked by the results. Here's an example of a magician doing an illusion. Okay, now that we've seen that, we also can note that there's a long and storied tradition of magicians doing illusions that stretches well back in history. Here's a short video clip talking about illusions and how magicians like to use them to make a career.
Looks simple, doesn't it?
To become a perfect sleight of hand artist is possible. You can get close, and it takes years. My favorite sleight of hand artist of all time was Cardini. He invented a lot of the techniques that magicians use today, but it wasn't just that. It was the context. He had a character and he had a plot. He was a tipsy gentleman, English gentleman coming home from a society affair, and the cards that would appear in his fingers appeared by themselves. He wasn't controlling them. And then another one would appear and he would get more confused and throw it away, and it was as if he was hallucinating the whole performance, and that the magic was happening around him. And that's a story of our lives. Magic is happening around us all the time, and he was the essence of a man in a magical world.
Welsh magician named Richard Valentine Pitchford, performing as Cardini, elevated card magic to an art form. His dexterity was so great he could even manipulate cards while wearing gloves. Most performers today who include card magic in their act owe a debt to Cardini. The manipulations and palming techniques that he invented are the basis of many modern routines. Cardini was a true master of all kinds of sleight of hand. Few modern performers can match his skill with a billiard ball.
What I want to caution us of, after we've seen these videos and thought about the fact that yes, there are many illusions and our brains are susceptible to them, is that we're going to take back what Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize laureate, storyteller, and bongo drummer once said: just because a good magician can do something shouldn't make you right away jump to the conclusion that it's a real phenomenon going on. In fact, we need to be cautious that we're not being tricked. Why does all of this matter? Because again, if we don't know that phenomena exist, then we can't know about causation. And if we don't know causation, we don't know about risk. And if we don't know about risk, we can't manage it. So we've sort of dove deep down the rabbit hole here a little bit into some philosophy and some examples. We're going to flush this out in more detail in the next series of classes, looking at various illusions, and then questioning, is there some way to dispel some of them? It's not an easy thing to do, but we at least need to be aware that these illusions exist, catalog them, and try our best to avoid running into them and making mistakes about what in fact is going on. Okay, that's enough for today. I'll see you on the chat boards.